In this lecture, we're going to take a look at mindfulness and what role it might play in sport or enhancing sport performance. So why might we look at mindfulness? Well, interest in the concept of mindfulness has been exploding for the last few decades in psychology and particularly in applied psychology. Lots of new psychotherapies and psychological treatments tend to involve some aspect of mindfulness. Just the presence of mindfulness in our research literature has been growing exponentially over the last 20 years or so. Some of the things we know from the applied psychology and the clinical psychology literature include things like mindfulness is associated with a variety of positive health and mental health outcomes. Less depression, less anxiety, less substance use, all sorts of positive outcomes. And there's also very good evidence from the treatment literature that mindful meditation is useful at reducing pain, reducing anxiety, and reducing depression. So we're seeing mindfulness be useful in lots of other areas of psychology. We also know that the experience of mindfulness, the mindfulness state, shares a lot of characteristics of peak performance and flow states that are associated with excellent performance. Things like a relaxed body, a calm and clear mind, focus in the present that feels free of distractions, and a non-judgmental focus that people don't feel, self-conscious and constantly judging, but just feel free. A lot of those things are the descriptors you might recall we talked about associated with peak performance and flow states that lead to good human performance. So it might make sense that mindfulness is sort of a fertile ground to look for how to create the ideal psychological states for performance. So what do we mean exactly by mindfulness? Well, mindfulness itself we can describe as a state of consciousness or a way of being that's defined as paying attention on purpose in the present moment without judgment. That's what we mean by being mindful or being in a state of mindfulness. Paying attention on purpose in the present with a non-judgmental stance. Mindfulness can also have trait-like properties. So sometimes we'll talk about a construct in our literature called trait mindfulness. And what that means is that some people are just naturally more mindful. Their personality is kind of mindful by nature. And so mindfulness sometimes we refer to as almost like a personality trait. And then there's mindful meditation. Mindful meditation is the application, the intentional practice of trying to create and practice recreating the state of mindfulness. That's all it is. That's all mindfulness meditation is. Now, a lot of times when people think about both mindfulness and meditation, they get kind of associated in our minds with perhaps Eastern religions or that sort of thing. But it's important to note that mindfulness and meditation are not associated necessarily with any religion or any spiritual practice. It can be an entirely secular psychological phenomenon, not having anything to do with spirituality. That's not to say that there certainly are some religions and religious practices that do have meditation or meditation-like practices that are a part of their spiritual traditions. I put a couple of images here on the slide that sort of reflect some of our stereotypical ideas of the Buddha pose for doing meditation. Completely not necessary to actually do or use meditation, but often it's what people think of as that pose. And I have on here what's called a labyrinth, which is actually a practice in some Christian traditions, like the Taizé Christian tradition, that involves walking the labyrinth, kind of this maze-like path that's a trance-like or meditation-like experience for folks as a practice within a Christian tradition. So there's all kinds of different religious traditions that have things that look a lot like meditation or that may explicitly talk about meditation or mindfulness. But that's not really what we're talking about here today. We're talking about just a psychological phenomenon, a psychological practice that doesn't need to be tied to any particular religion or spiritual tradition. So mindful meditation, as we mentioned, is the intentional practice of that mindful state of awareness. It's about trying to practice that state in a focused way to try to be able to recreate it on an ongoing way in one's daily life. In that way, it's much like relaxation strategies we talked about in a different lecture, where the more you practice them, the more it becomes easy to quickly get into that state of being. Well, meditation is the same, that the more you practice mindful meditation strategies, the more quickly you can get yourself into a mindful state when you want to be, or catch yourself being non-mindful and move towards a more mindful state, perhaps during a sport competition, for example. Now, mindful meditation can be really simple. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It doesn't always require a meditation room or meditation clothes. Or one of the things that I sort of get frustrated with is when you find like meditation audio scripts or YouTube videos or whatever, they seem to always have the mood music in the background and the really quiet, therapist voice and whatnot. It doesn't require any of that to do mindful meditation. Regular people, wherever you are in your daily life, can do mindful meditation without any of those sort of meditation decorations, I guess, that tend to come along with those sorts of things. Meditation is just a state of intentional awareness in the present moment without judgment. You can do that anywhere, anytime, in whatever clothes you happen to be wearing, and actually with whatever kind of music you like to listen to, or none at all. There's a lot of varieties of mindful meditation. It's not always about, and in fact, mindful meditation rarely has like the mantra. You might be thinking about people, repeating a simple word like Om or something. That's really not what mindful meditation typically does. Mindful meditation is really about just directing your awareness. And so some mindfulness meditation practices involve just focusing on breathing, just trying to really give your attention to your breathing, pay attention to it, the sensations of air coming in, the sensations of air going out, and your chest rising and lowering as you breathe, and those sorts of things. That's all there is to it, is bring awareness to something that you're doing all the time, but almost all the time it's completely outside of your awareness. So just directing your awareness to something simple like breathing is an example of a mindfulness meditation. Some mindfulness meditation scripts use a body scan, similar to the muscle relaxation strategies we talked about in a different lecture. This can involve just simply scanning the body and paying attention to the sensations and perceptions. How do your feet feel inside your shoes? How does your butt feel on your chair? What do you feel in your fingertips right now? And can you feel the air moving across your face from the air conditioning or something like that? Just simply paying attention to your body and the sensations and perceptions that might be there all the time that, again, are outside of our awareness. There are meditations that involve just scanning cognitive content or your thoughts. There's a very popular meditation practice called Leaves on a Stream, where you're asked to sort of visualize fallen leaves passing on a stream, and you see your thoughts as kind of those leaves, that a thought comes into your mind. It's just a thought. You don't have to act on it. You have to judge it. It just sort of passes right by, and pretty soon it's on down the stream, and there's new thoughts to pay attention to. That's an example of non-judgmental thought observation type of meditation. And another that is sometimes used is actually meditation about movement. So paying really close attention in the present moment to what your sensations are when you go through certain movements. Those movements might be things like yoga poses or stretching. You can actually practice mindful meditation as an athlete while you're stretching to prepare for practice or a match, just by simply directing your attention to the sensations and the movements of the stretching process. You can also do mindful meditation about your own sport skills. So you can have a mindful meditation experience, rehearsing a golf swing or a tennis serve, or running a route as a receiver, whatever that might be. Actually, while you're making those movements, just paying mindful attention to those in the present without judgment, you're doing mindfulness. That's it. And you're meditating right there. It's just as simple as that. So how are we seeing mindfulness applied to sport? Well, sports psychologists have really been interested in this for many, many years, dating back at least the 1960s, when a thing called transcendental meditation, or the transcendental movement, was a big thing. That was a different kind of meditation brought in by some practitioners of Eastern religions. But in modern days, we're seeing a couple new developments. For example, there's the mindfulness acceptance commitment approach of Frank Gardner and Zella Moore. They derived their approach directly from some innovations in the psychological treatment literature and clinical psychology that are looking at acceptance-based behavior therapies as an example. There's three main parts to their approach. First of all, they use techniques to train mindful awareness, and that includes simple exercises that look like the mindful meditation we talked about on the previous slide. Then there's also a focus on identifying the athlete's values and what their goals are related to those values, and trying to really keep their attention on those values. And those values aren't always being a champion or winning. Those values might be being a good role model. Those values might be expressing their talent, whatever that might be. And there's also a variety of techniques that are cognitive in nature related to promoting acceptance and cognitive diffusion. What we mean by that is trying to take a non-judgmental acceptance view of thoughts as they occur and realizing that our thoughts are not the same thing as reality. That's what we mean by cognitive diffusion, is your thoughts are not reality. Let me give you a quick example of that. Let's say you're an athlete who frequently finds yourself frustrated with the officiating, which happens in a lot of different sports. And you find yourself really struggling with that. It distracts you, it gets you off your game, it really is not helpful. Well, one way to approach that is to do this cognitive diffusion thing where maybe you recognize that having the thought go through your mind as that ref isn't being fair to me isn't necessarily reality. That's just a thought that occurs to you. That's just your brain doing what brains do, generating thoughts. It might be better to recognize that that might or might not be a thing. I'll just accept what's happened so far as what has happened and be curious about what's going to happen in the future, but not being so sure that for the rest of this match, that ref is going to be unfair in their calls in the match. So that's an example of cognitive fusion. It's just recognizing that our thoughts are just thoughts. They're not reality, and letting go a little bit of necessarily predicting the future based on the content of our thoughts. There's also an approach by Kaufman and his colleagues that's called mindful sport performance enhancement, which is really more of a traditional mindfulness approach. It really focuses on just the strategies to promote mindful awareness moment to moment, and uses a lot of the different kinds of meditation practices, body scan meditation, some yoga movement stuff, focus on breathing, that just focuses on developing mindfulness. So those are a couple examples that are out there that are being developed for trying to enhance performance in the world of sport with mindfulness. So what does the research say? That might be an interesting thing to take a look at. Well, the research base is pretty small, but I think it is growing, sort of following the trends we see in the other mainstream psychology literature. I found an interesting meta-analysis from 2015. You'll recall a meta-analysis is a study of studies. That's a study that tries to gather all the information we know from all the published literature and look at what does that tell us as a whole. And so that was this meta-analysis that Sappington and Longshore published. They found 6 case studies, 2 qualitative reviews, 7 non-randomized trials. You might recall those are studies that may have a pre and post test but no control group or no randomization. And then 4 randomized trials. Those are the true experiments that participants get randomized to one group or another. There's comparison control conditions, and we see how things look by comparison. I put the figure on the slide here from their paper that shows how complicated these things are. And if you look at the top, this figure here basically is a flow chart to show how they selected the studies that got included in their paper. And what you notice at the very top is they had to review almost 800 studies that they found before they finally settled on, 19 or so studies that got included in the final analysis. And you can see the various reasons why certain studies got sort of excluded from their review. And I think it's sort of useful to see how that happens in meta-analyses, that you start with sort of, getting your arms around all the literature you could find and then whittling it down until you're really focused on what are the studies most relevant to my particular purpose for this study. So they went from 800 studies down to 19. Pretty interesting. The upshot of their meta-analysis was that they found promising support for the efficacy of mindfulness. There was some good reason to think this might be helpful and should be studied further. They found that mindfulness is associated with reductions in anxiety, can increase the experience of flow states, which are good for sport performance, and they may actually improve performance. Some studies included objective measures of performance that there were improvements on after experiencing mindfulness training. Now, overall, they found the quality of studies not great, kind of lacking, but that's not at all uncommon, especially when a research literature is fairly new or young, what we might call a research frontier. Often studies start off kind of tentative, smaller samples, not the most rigorous designs. And I would expect over the next 20 years or so, we're going to see a real dramatic improvement in the quantity and the quality of studies of mindfulness in sport, just given how popular it's becoming. So the key takeaways from this lecture: we know that mindfulness is growing in popularity and certainly growing in sport applications as it is across all of psychology. Mindfulness involves a lot of qualities that are associated with sport performance. It looks a lot like flow states or peak performance states, the state of being mindful. And so mindful interventions, I think of as a kitchen sink intervention, kind of, they include a little bit of everything. There are several benefits to just one activity. If you think about the various benefits to mindful meditation, you get some practice at focus and concentration, some practice at relaxation, some practice at concentration. There's a lot of really great things that sort of go into meditation that make it perhaps an ideal intervention for sport performance. Not surprisingly, sports psychologists are developing new applications of mindfulness to sport, and I think those will continue to develop. And the evidence so far is pretty promising, but we need a lot more study in the future, and I think those studies are going to come.